I'm thrilled to be asked to come here and talk about Rick's novel. And I have to tell you that, what was it, Rick, 2 years ago, 3 years ago at dinner, that you told me the idea of this novel?
I believe that that's the case, and you didn't discourage me. It was kind of you.
No, when Rick told me the idea, I mean, do you know the basic plot? That there is this black woman and this white Massachusetts,
Congressman.
not yet,
Okay.
at Harvard.
Yeah, yeah.
They're students at Harvard, and they kind of fall in love with each other. And then she abruptly leaves just before graduation. And then, what, 18, 19 years later, now he's a congressman,
Yes.
the Massachusetts person. And he turns on Morning Joe. Does anybody watch Morning Joe? And he sees that a 19-year-old black
Voting rights worker.
voting rights worker has been accused of murdering a white sheriff, and he realizes that that is his son. So I thought, wow, that's what you told me at dinner, I think.
Yeah, I thought it was a good premise for building a novel. It took a little bit of work, but yeah.
No, I thought it was a fabulous present. And so then what happened? The next thing is, this fall, chapters of this novel arrive. Like a Dickens novel. You know, you get one chapter, and then a few weeks later you get another chapter. So I read it chapter by chapter, waiting for the next chapter. Finally, the novel comes and I finish it. And then I read it a second time this summer and was completely gripped by it. And it occurred to me that we all know that Rick Patterson was a lawyer who became a fabulous novelist. And so we know that he knows how to write about trials, and he really does. I mean, I learned so much about courtrooms and trials, and the whole drama of a trial. It holds you as you read this novel. You want to know what's going to happen. Are they going to have Malcolm, that's the boy, testify? And what's the pro and con, and what happens when he does? But there is another novel in this novel. And it really fascinated me. And in fact, it made me think about. I remember in college, I had to read this book called The Education of Henry Adams. Did anybody else have to read that? I mean, about somebody who's educated in one time to find himself living in another time. And this novel is really about the education of the central character, in some ways, Chase Brevard,
Hmm.
about living in a time when this country comes to race consciousness.
Well, I should probably start by saying why I came up with this premise and why I wrote the book in the first place. Genesis was that I wrote something like over 300 essays or columns about American politics and society between 2015 and 2021. And it occurred to me again and again and again that my subject matter was directly or indirectly about the problems of race in this country. It wasn't just people trying to ban the 1619 Project or trying to suppress racial history. It was that, to me, what permeated the rise of Trump was not economics, but race and culture. And so I tried to design a book which dealt with the issues that I kept seeing as reflecting the toxins of race in our society right now. Voter suppression, which is ground zero in Georgia. The problems of getting a fair trial for a black defendant in racially charged circumstances. The exploitation of racial anger and anxiety by right wing politicians in the media, unequal law enforcement, the rise of white nationalism. And so I really tried to come up with a plot which would dramatize those subjects in a way that was accessible to people by presenting it in terms of a story where you cared about the people. Because you don't care about the people, you don't care about anything else. But my friend Pat Conroy, late Pat Conroy, once said that fiction is where I go to tell the truth. And I think that fiction is an important vehicle for asking people to think about the problems of this country in a different way. I say particularly white people for whom the problem of thinking about race is optional. Um, and most of my readership, demographic necessity is white, but they might not pick up something which expressly deals with race as an academic or a non-fictional subject, but they might well um, find themselves thinking about the problems of race in this country in a different way if it was presented to them in a story which engaged their emotions as well as their intellect. So that's basically
Well,
why I went about doing what I did.
I think you did that, and I think you did that in a way that was extraordinary because you raised a question here, which is what happens when a white man, sort of midway in his life, suddenly discovers that he is, at least biologically, the father of a black child.
Well, it's a
And
fast. Oh,
no,
go ahead.
I wanted to say because to me, I think a lot of the controversy you ran into, at least as I understand it, is the question that in fact your character asks in the book, because that's what you've succeeded, I think, brilliantly in this. Can a white man become the father of a black child? And what does it mean? What does it take for that to happen? Because if I go through your book, there are a series of questions. What can I be to you? He imagines asking Malcolm that for both of our sakes, what should I be? He could not declare himself a father without at least trying to become one, whatever that meant in his son's life and his own. I don't know anything about being a father, and I have a black son charged with murder who has no idea why I'm here. Instead, he stopped and turned toward the woman and camera behind her and gave the answer of a father to the question, "Why are you here?" He said, "Because Malcolm Hill is innocent." I don't know anything about being a father, and I have a black son charged with murder who has no idea why I'm here. What is it like to visit him? Hard. I never quite know what to say or how he's reacting inside, except yesterday when I asked about his grandfather. But you are a father, says the mother, and you are already learning what it means to have a black son. And he says, I don't want to lose you again, Malcolm. That's what you saw today. And then at the end, you ask an amazing question, but were they really that different? And Malcolm the son says, I'm just starting to deal with the ways that I'm somebody like you. So this novel could only be written by a white man. And it raises a question that I think is, I think it's a huge question. Can a white man become a father to a black son in, as you say, a society dealing with racism? And I thought maybe you would read to us from, I thought this chapter 28 is a, I think I've given enough background, but you'll give more if you need to.
Well, I hasten to add that this comes as a complete shock to me. So I didn't know it was going to be Uncle Rick's story hour. But uh, the question is, how much would you like me to read, Carol?
But I have to say, I asked you, would you like
Okay.
me to tell you before what I think, or would you like me
Oh
to
no,
tell you
no.
right here?
I mean, which?
And I really think that the question here is you've written a book that only a white person could write. And it's a very, very deep and complicated question, which your character asks throughout the book, which is, can he be a father
Well,
to this black son in trouble? So,
well, this relationship. And I hasten to add that the central characters in this book are three. There's Malcolm the defendant. There's Chase the father, and then there's Allie Hill, the mother, who's a seminal leader of a voting rights group in Georgia, nationally prominent and despised by the political right. So there are really three of them. And of the two of them, the relationship between Allie and Chase is the one that permeates the entire novel. And it's interesting because I portray them meeting at Harvard. And at that point, she is the outsider coming into a largely white and privileged world. And what happens as a result of this trial is that Chase is from a family of privilege in Massachusetts, has to go to Georgia to meet this young man and to see what has happened with him, and then gradually becomes immersed in the whole business of race in the South. And I hasten to add, race in Boston's no picnic either. Um, but so Carol goes to precisely this. He learns in a different way through having a black son at a more intimate uh, distance what the problems of black people in Georgia are,
Right.
and he has to live them. And the irony of him discovering that he has a son who is directly subject to all the vagaries of race in America, is part of the drama of the book, the education of the book. It's part of what both pulls him and Allie together, and it sometimes separates them in their perception of what's to be done. Um, but this is a book in which the two major characters are black and white. So yeah, I'm perfectly qualified to write a white congressman from a privileged background who likes women. That's not a stretch for me. Um, but it was also important to me to do Allie in a way that had integrity, dignity, and reality. And so here's what I did to write her. Um, I went, my wife and I went to Georgia, to a prototypical county with a tough racial past and present. We interviewed 50 people, more than 50 people. The majority of them were black ministers, community leaders, politicians, civil rights lawyers, voting rights lawyers, ordinary folks. And I tried to get a sense of what it would be like to grow up black in that environment, what her family would be like, what her perception would be like, what her feelings of obligation to the larger community would be like. Because I was training at Harvard, I asked Henry Louis Gates, Skip Gates, who many of you know, can you connect me with 3 or more black women who went to Harvard during that period of time? And I asked them what that experience was like, why they went there, what their first days were like, the best and worst of it, how they feel it impacted them afterwards. And I got some remarkably candid answers because once people think that you were sincerely invested in knowing about what they know, they're remarkably generous in telling you. One of them was Tracy K. Smith, who was later became poet laureate. And Tracy was just remarkably helpful. But I also went to see the successor to Stacey Abrams as the head of the New Georgia Project, which is a leading voting rights group in Georgia and a model for voting rights groups elsewhere. And I asked her about what her experience was like, not only the professional challenges, which are enormous, but the personal challenges. You mean the fact that she really lives in fear for her life, the fact that right wingers put up on websites directions to her home and her photograph, the fact that her staff is threatened, that they have to protect their headquarters from bomb threats, all of that kind of things. The personal price. Finally, I talked to black moms about what is commonplace to black moms, but what white moms don't have to think about, how their kids deal with the particular dangers of being a black person in a world where justice is arbitrary, and where things can happen to you in a moment of mischance. And so what I felt I had done in creating Allie was to reflect back all the experiences that people shared with me, and it took her from a concept to a real person, a person I could believe in, a person I thought I knew, and therefore I thought that my readers would feel that they could believe in that dynamic of the two people dealing with from very different circumstances, very different regions, who loved each other in college, but came apart. He never knew that he had a son. Having to compose all these differences in the crucible of a nationally televised murder trial in which he could be potentially sentenced to death or life in prison, I thought was a very good premise for talking about the problems of race in this country. So.
I agree with you. I found myself just personally, though, Rick, really moved by the question that Chase has: can he be a father to this? I mean, can this white privileged congressman really be in a meaningful psychological sense a father to this black son of his who's really in trouble? And I think most of the book he struggles
Well,
with that
and I
question.
think an even bigger problem for the character of Malcolm, the 18-year-old, um, than for Chase in one sense. I mean, Chase has to cross a lot of mental boundaries to put himself in a position of being a dad. Now, imagine you're Malcolm, you're 18 years old, you've never had a father. You're a light-skinned black man because you're mixed race. You're dealing with all the complications around that. The feeling you want to strongly identify as black. Anger over what has happened to young black people is typified by the George Floyd case, which comes in mentioned for that. How does he accept the unwelcome surprise that the father he's always imagined is not a black man on whom he could imagine modeling himself, but a privileged white guy? So all of that. I mean, this is race is the biggest dividing line, I think, in many ways that we have. But it's certainly not the only one. What makes us different from each other? Any number of things. What kind of family we had. What kind of place we grew up in. The prevalence of love and trauma in our life. Economics, class, mischance, opportunity. All the things that happen to us.
I want to talk about where you go with this because I think you take us to places that we don't usually go, which is what happens when Malcolm realizes. I mean, he's been very close to his black grandfather, that his athleticism, his height, his certain qualities in himself that he values come from his white father.
Well,
I mean, that's. I don't think you answer these, but I think you ask us to think about these issues, which we've come to think about in somewhat kind of, I think, simplistic terms, in which only I think a novel can do, to enter them through a character who's struggling with them, as Malcolm.
yes.
And at the end, it's very close to the end of the book. I wrote this down because I thought it was so interesting. But were they really that different? One's white, one's black, but they have these things in common. How do you even understand that? How does this black child integrate it when he's has so much reason, to be antagonistic toward whites and so? I
Well,
think you're doing a novelist's job here.
Well, I mean, it's one of the strengths of fiction is you can actually, you know, permeate people's minds in a way that nonfiction can't. But one of the key scenes around the issues you're talking about is where the black sheriff, and we interviewed, by the way, the first elected black sheriff of this county, um, um, talks to Malcolm when Malcolm's awaiting trial, and he says, "I never had a dad," and I tried to tell myself of his loss. And you've got this man who shows up and says he wants the job. What are you going to do with that?
Right.
But in a way, Malcolm has always wanted somebody who wanted the job. He just didn't exactly get what he was looking for.
He didn't want a white man.
But on the other hand, you can see the ways in which they're alike. I mean, we all have kids and parents. We all know the ways in which we are genetically, you know, like some relative or another. And Malcolm can see it clearly enough. And the whole psychology of this. I mean, it's one thing to write a book about the issues of race, and I tried to do that in an honest and forthright way. But it also interested in writing about how the issues of race affect us all psychologically.
Right.
At one point, Chase looks at Malcolm, who's sitting in prison, the first time he ever meets him, and he realizes that Malcolm looks like has certain resemblance to his French father. Chase's father was a Parisian. And he muses on the sort of astonishment that his father, Chase's French father, has now become part of that stream of humanity which America thinks of as black. It was a fascinating moment to contemplate as an author what that would feel like to the dad.
Do you want to read some of the book?
Um, I'm just trying to um, find a passage which might illustrate some of this. Um, and there's one part where Chase, for the first time, um, visits um, um, Chase or visits Malcolm's room in the home where he's growing up with Allie. And Malcolm's in prison now, so it's just Chase and his mom. Um, they stood there in the doorway to Malcolm's bedroom. Allie had his shoulder. He seemed reluctant to step inside, as though this were a place he did not belong. She wondered whether Chase was thinking, as she had since the shooting, that their son might never set foot here again. Briefly touching his arm, she led him inside. He stood there, hands in his pockets, looking first at the photographs. He stopped to consider the picture of Malcolm with his grandfather outside the Atlanta Stadium. I guess that's your dad. Yes, for a moment, Ellie considered whether it would be hurtful for Chase to hear about Malcolm's grandfather as surrogate father, then decided not to censor the truth of their son's life. They are very close. They'd watch sports together, go fishing, play horseshoes, or catch after dinner. My dad went to all his games, never missed a one. Chase's voice was tinged with regret. It must have been nice for both of them. It was. But Allie could not bring herself to say that Wilson Hill was the man Malcolm sat next to every Sunday dinner, the man who pretended that Malcolm could outrun him until soon enough he could. Nor could she imagine the moments when Malcolm was little, and she had imagined it was Chase rather than her father playing in the yard with their son. Chase was looking at another picture of 3-year-old Malcolm on his grandfather's shoulders. Was it hard for him after your dad died? At once, Allie remembered the stricken look on Malcolm's face when he ran outside to find her. More than hard. They were outside playing horseshoes, and Dad just dropped to his knees and was gone. By the time we got back to him, there were already tears streaming down Malcolm's face. In his own way, Malcolm took it worse than my mom or me. At least Mom has her faith. I still have some. But I think Malcolm is still trying to find a God he can entrust his grandfather to. For a moment, Chase was silent. Then he resumed, contemplating the artifacts of Malcolm's life. His certificate as class president, his trophy for athlete of the year. I hear he was an incredible football player. You should have seen him, Allie almost said, and then stopped herself. For me, it was always more about leadership and how he did in school. But hand that boy a football, he was something to see. Quiet, Chase kept looking around for clues. Malcolm's books, mostly concerning the present or past of black Americans. His acceptance letter to Morehouse, the barbells he lifted, the full-length mirror in which Allie would find himself studying the man he was swiftly becoming. Finally, he turned to face her. I guess you know how strange this is for me. I have a son who existed in a parallel universe. I missed everything about him, everything he ever did or thought or felt. Um, it was a fascinating experience to write this book because it's a little bit like method acting. You have to really try to put yourself in the heart and minds of these people. And if I never write another novel, and I may well not, I am very proud. I mean, other people can decide how good or bad this book is. Well, I'm very proud to have made the attempt to write it. Um, I certainly think it gave me a deeper understanding. And one of the great things about writing fiction is that it licenses your curiosity. You go out and find about things that are really important, but you otherwise would never dare to ask about, or not have an excuse for asking about. In a way, a fiction writer gets licensed to learn about all sorts of things. And as much as I thought I understood a fair amount about the politics of race, because I've been around law and politics all my life, I didn't know nearly enough to write this book. And what I learned in writing it was quite incredible. I'll tell you one anecdote, which I relate in the book. In my researches, Nance and I met a young black community leader who took us all around America's Georgia, which is the county seat of Sumter County, in which we model a county. And he just completely exposed the sociology and history of this town to me in a way that I could not have done if I'd spent, you know, 10 years there. But one thing he did is he took me to the black and white cemeteries in Sumter County, and they were completely segregated. I mean, there was no diversity, even in death. I mean, I asked the young man if there were any like white folks in a black cemetery or any black folks in a white cemetery, and he looked at me like, "Have you just landed from Mars?" No. And we went to the white cemetery, very well tended, you know, big monuments, all sorts of, you know, commemorations to the Confederate dead and all of that. And we went to the black cemetery, which was a more a modest affair. But at one point, we stopped at something that just struck me. There was a series, a section of a series of small gravestones, uniformly small gravestones, different than the other monuments, the other sections of the black cemetery. And you know, Mark said, "We call this Babyland." And I said, "Well, what's that?" And by the way, next to a number of the stones were dolls or toys, as if gifts to a child. And he said, "This is a section for people who have, you know, kids who have died in infancy or childhood, black children." And it was mute testament to the toll of decent health care denied. And the last gifts that their parents could give them or their families could give them were a toy or a doll next to their gravestone. I mean, I just had no words for this. Um, so, you know, it was just an invaluable experience.
You know, I wonder because I thought another place which was extraordinary in terms of entering the interior of a character is the very end of the book where you enter the interior of Allie. And I wonder if you would read that and then we could go to questions.
Well, one of the characters who doesn't occupy a lot of space but was fascinating to write about was Allie's mother, who had lived through the terrible periods of Jim Crow and segregation and you know, overt racial violence and all the rest. And so, and the two of them are very close. But I'll try to find the very end of
It's 424.
okay, thank you. Okay. In early evening, Allie sat on the front porch with her mother, quietly watching as dust settled over their property. Malcolm was in his bedroom, listening to music before the two women bestirred themselves to make dinner. For the half hour until now, they had observed him systematically shooting baskets from an imaginary arc around the hoop his grandfather had put up for him, one shot after the other, as though repeating this once familiar ritual would bring him a little closer to who he had been before George Bullock stopped him. That's the deputy, by the way. After her son went inside, the image limbered with Allie and, she thought, Janie. Finally, Janie said, "So he still wants Malcolm, even without you." This refers to Chase. Yes. Janie nodded, thought he would. From childhood on, Allie had learned to follow her mother's thoughts, so it did not surprise her when, after a while, Janie asked, "So how are you doing without him?" Allie paused, allowing herself to absorb the painful truth of her answer. "I knew it would be hard, but it's much harder than I thought." Funny you hadn't learned that, Janie observed, but maybe 20 years is too short a time. As was typical, Janie just let the remark sit there. Turning, Allie demanded, "Why don't you just say it, Mama?" Janie folded her hands in her lap, gazing out their fields with a contemplative expression. "I know you think you asked too much of Malcolm, but right now I'm wondering whether we asked too much of you." Allie shook her head, resistance. "I've done what I wanted to do. And you've done it well for 20 years now. No one could be prouder of you than I am. What I'm not so proud of as a mother is knowing how happy you are and watching you push all that aside. Her mother faced her. When I look out at this place, know what I think of? All these years your father and I had together, the family made with you and then Malcolm. I was there, Allie said. I couldn't have built Blue Georgia without you. That's the organization she runs. For a moment, the woman who had been with Allie since the dawn of consciousness gazed into her face. I know, Alexandria, but what else have you built for yourself? Stung, Allie wondered if her mother knew how unfair the question felt and how much asking of it hurt. But of course, she knew both things very well. I can't run away, Allie answered sharply. Janie took both hands in hers. You've got your own family staring you in the face, and you put so much on yourself, you call that running away. I call it running towards something you've never had, and that Malcolm won't have unless you take stock of things. How do you think the two of them will do better as father and son? With you or without you? Allie fell quiet. With me, she acknowledged. But that depends on so much. I told Chase I'm not a political wife. Did he ask you to be? He wants to run for the Senate. I want him to. Janie looked at her intently. So maybe you can talk it through with him. I'm not saying politics isn't hard on a couple, or that it wouldn't be especially hard on you. Well, I've met the man, and I can't imagine he wants you to be running after him from one campaign stop after another. He would want you to have your own life. I've already got my own life, Allie insisted, right here. What would I say to myself if I leave with so much left to do? Janie, consider this, that there will always be more to do, that there are other places you're needed, that no one should become indispensable, that sooner or later you'd have to raise up some new Allie Hill to continue what you started. Her voice softened. You need your own permission to be happy, not mine. But in the way back, maybe it felt like you did. So 20 years ago, if you decided to be with him, what would you have told us? Imagining this, Allie felt her throat constrict. They'll never love anyone like this. And now, Allie drew a breath. That I know it's true. Standing, Janie bent forward and softly kissed the top of her daughter's head. Then maybe you should sit with us for a while. I'll go to see if Malcolm will help me with dinner. Part of the things that make all of us who we are, for better or worse, are family. And one thing I tried to do was portray family, particularly this black family, but also Chase's very different white family, a much more emotionally remote crew, and the potential family that Allie and Chase and Malcolm could be if they can surmount all these various difficulties. So, this is a book which is about race, to be sure, but it's also about parents and children, about love lost and found. It's about how we become family and the choices we make along the way. And I think that, as much as is anything, is the thing which will involve readers in the dilemma of these characters.
Thank you. You must have questions. Liz, you have a question?
Look forward to reading your book. Thanks a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, question is, Ms. Gilligan's first question to you kind of borders on what you said in your interview in the Gazette, which was that you were turned down by 19 publishers who couldn't imagine that you, talented, legendary author, could write something as what you've written. So could you comment on that a little bit? And before I leave, I want to answer a little bit your question, which is, can a white man be a father to a black son? Absolutely. Can a white woman be a mother to a black girl? Of course, absolutely. They walk amongst us here on Martha's Vineyard. Go to Oak Bluffs. First, you have to be a parent. You have to be the father or the mother. Then, you have to do the work to understand the challenges facing the child. And the third thing is you have to be ready yourself to stand up and support the child when they run into difficulties with others who have no idea what's going on, who don't like what's going on. The question was, could you talk about the 19 publishers who turned down your work?
Sure.
You have that in common with Anne Frank, by the way.
Yeah, and thank you for the question, and thank you for the comments as well. Those are quite meaningful, I think, to many people who've had to think about this issue in one way or another. The problem that I ran into, nobody told me that the book was in any way racially insensitive or obtuse. The operating assumption now is no longer safe or right for white authors to write through the point of view of black characters about subjects which afflict blacks in particular, but ought to concern us all. Race is not just a problem of people of color, it's an American problem, and we have yet to resolve it. I think certainly when you interrogate experiences not your own, you have to do the work. That's why I tried to meet people where they lived in Georgia. But if you think about preemptive censorship, basically we cannot publish a book by a white author because it keeps us from seeing what's being censored. Not only because it happens within the quiet precincts of publishers, because very often authors will shy away from tough subjects at all because they're afraid that they won't be published. This kind of thing to somebody other than me who hadn't had his career, it would not only kill the novel, it would crush a career potentially. But the irony too is this preemptive censorship is, to me, primarily a white people's deal. The black Georgians who were helpful to me cared about the truth of their stories, didn't particularly care about who I was or that I was a published author, and they took the leap of faith that I could do it justice. But it's fair to say, given the demographics of publishing in Manhattan, I wish it were otherwise, that virtually everyone who turned down my book was white. It's also a lot that they had virtually no lived experience at all of what the people in Georgia share with me from their own lived experience. And yet they presume to be the literary benefactors of black America. I'm sure they all feel good about it. It's a kind of lazy way of being race conscious. But it's censorship, and censorship is no better than censorship by right-wingers of America's racial history or other books that they don't like. It's just the wrong way to go about it. We need more non-white folks in publishing, editing, agenting, and in between the pages of books, although we're doing some better with that than we used to. But this is kind of a wrong-headed thing. The other thing is it assumes that identity is all-consuming. Now, and it assumes that like all white people are in some ways alike, and all white people or black people in some ways alike, in ways that nobody can understand. So I am perfectly qualified, right, to write a book about a white high school dropout from an abusive family in Appalachia, but not a black woman who goes to Harvard. You think about that. It not only denies the empathy and imagination, which should be the engine of any good fiction, but it assumes all sorts of things about it assumes away the variety of human nature. I was saying yesterday, we spend our lives trying to understand people who are different than us. And although race is one of the great defining differences of our time, and perhaps the most defining, which is why I wrote the book, it is really not the only difference which makes people different from each other. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out my own family because they're different than me. It's the stuff we do all the time.
I think I got up too early. I had a question that's very much about this, and I know you had these difficulties getting the book published because of not just white publishing and them thinking that you couldn't represent black experience, but the whole sensitivity people in publishing now that books have to be read by the sensitivity expert to make sure they don't offend anyone. And also the whole stay in your lane, okay? So, which is much bigger than just black and white. But I guess what I'm just wondering what the response has been to your book and whether you've gotten any blowback or criticism or stay in your lane-ism as a result of the book.
Well, I've gotten stay in your lane-ism, but it doesn't have to do with the content of the book. On the subject of sensitivity readers, I suppose I had three of the best I could find. They weren't people who were hired to find something particularly wrong with the book, and they were three people who've been active, three black men who've been active in the struggle over civil rights and voting rights. A lawyer, a black lawyer and judge in Georgia, a federal judge who'd been a member of the voting rights section and done of the Justice Department, done extensive work in the South, and a former head of the NAACP. How they feel about the book can be found in the back of the book. So I felt comfortable that the objections to my book were basically based on ethnic category rather than substance. I haven't gotten a lot of blowback on substance, none really.
Okay, I guess what I'm wondering is, since the book has been published.
Yes, that's what I mean.
But
Since,
you're talking about the three people who read it when
yeah,
it was a manuscript.
I
since
have
it's been
not
published.
seen. I mean, my wife is kind enough to cite me to Amazon and Goodreads, and I have not seen anything which suggests that thousands of readers, anyone who's found this racially insensitive. I found some people who said you shouldn't have done it, but again, it wasn't a critique grounded in the substance of the book. It's this notion somehow or another that I was preempting somebody else from writing that book. If you think about that, it's literally impossible, because every book is a thing of its own. It's a creation of its author, which would not exist except for that author. And fiction isn't fungible in that way. It's not like authors are applying for the same job in an org chart. Literature simply doesn't work like that.
Do you have any regrets from these publishers who
Oh,
turned you down?
I
Not
don't-
that they would share them with you, but
No,
just in case.
I don't think so, but I don't think I'll ever hear from them saying, like, I'm really sorry. And some of them were really quite overt. Comments like, you're too white for black people. You will be justly criticized for writing this book. Only people who are marginalized voices should write about these subjects, and on and on and on
I
and on.
wonder, I found myself wondering, Rick, I have no idea, I don't know what Liz would think about this either, but if you said that this is a book in part about a white man who finds himself falling in love with a black woman, that's a very powerful emotional line that Chase realizes.
Well,
that
and if you think about it, Carol, this book would have to be written by a committee, because you couldn't get the white guy right and get the black woman right. It's impossible.
But if it's from the point of view of the white guy, first of all, falling in love with this extraordinary black woman who he meets at Harvard, then unbeknownst to him, she has a child, and then in the most extreme circumstances, he's called upon to raise the question, could he be the father to this child? And he ends up defending him in court. Now, from that point of view, only a white person could write this book.
Well,
what I'm curious about is, I have no idea about the publishers in New York, but had you said that, would there have been a different conversation?
No, I knew I was walking into going in. Henry Louis Gates has written about this problem. Zadie Smith wrote about this problem. We all know about, or most of us know about the case of American Dirt. So I knew what I was asking for. The problem is that I wanted to write this book, and it was the book I wanted to write, and so I wrote it. And
really glad that you did. Thank you so much to both of you for an incredible conversation. And as I said, the book is for sale over at the Bunch of Greats tent over there. And right now, I know you have questions, but please allow Richard North Patterson to go directly to the book signing tent and get the books signed. We'll be starting our next session in 4 minutes.